The morning started like most others. Coffee, silence, sunlight slipping through the slats of the wooden blinds. I stood barefoot in the kitchen, spoon circling inside the cup with the slow rhythm of someone who didn't want to start the day but had no excuse not to. He was already gone. Left early, as usual. Business meetings, numbers, polite nods, colleagues. I didn't resent his work. Not exactly. It just took up too much space. Too much of him. Our house looked perfect from the outside. A modest modern build tucked into a quiet cul-de-sac, trimmed hedges, pale stone porch, matching mailboxes. His and hers, like everything else in our life. Neat, controlled, predictable. I was folding laundry when I saw the first thing that didn't belong. My phone buzzed on the windowsill. A message, not for me. He was watching you again. Be careful. No name, no context, no sender in my contact list. But I knew. I didn't even have to think. I looked up instinctively, and there he was. Across the fence, sleeves rolled, eyes lowered, fixing something near the base of the old cedar posts. The neighbor. He hadn't lived there long. A few months, maybe. We'd exchanged the occasional smile, a nod while taking out the trash, the kind of polite acknowledgement neighbors owe each other. But I'd felt it before. The pause. The moment too long. The glance that held just a second past appropriate. He didn't look over that time. But I stood there longer than I should have. The rest of the day passed in a haze of mechanical tasks. I cleaned the fridge, organized the spice rack, changed the bed sheets. Things I hadn't touched in weeks. I told myself I was just being productive, that I wasn't unsettled, that the text didn't mean anything. But I kept looking toward the window, and he was there again, still working on the fence. The same slow, patient movements, as if time worked differently on his side of the yard. That night, I couldn't sleep. Not from guilt, from restlessness. A thick kind that sticks to your ribs and makes the sheets feel too heavy. I turned over and over beside my husband, whose breath stayed steady, chest rising and falling in a rhythm I used to know by heart. Now, it just felt distant. I reached out and touched his arm lightly. He didn't stir. Or maybe he did and didn't care. It's not that he doesn't love me. He does, in his way. We don't fight. We make dinner together on weekends. We ask each other how work went. He buys me flowers on my birthday. Always the same bouquet. White roses and tulips. Predictable. Polite. But he stopped seeing me. I don't mean watching. I mean seeing, noticing, wanting. Touching without agenda or obligation. That part faded slowly until even I started doubting if it ever existed. Now, even when he did reach for me, it felt like a checklist. A nod to routine. His hands were careful. Too careful. I didn't want careful anymore. The next morning, I found something else. On top of the fence, tucked between the boards where two planks were uneven, a flower. A small one, wild, imperfect. Purple with frayed edges. Not store-bought, not dramatic, just placed there. Deliberately. I didn't know when he'd left it. I only knew it wasn't meant for someone else. I stood staring at it for a full minute. Then, without thinking, I reached out and touched it. It was still cool from the night air. Later that day, as I stepped outside to bring in the cushions from the patio, I saw him again. He was walking toward his garage, keys in hand. He glanced up. He didn't smile. Just looked. Steady. Director. It wasn't flirtation. It wasn't even invitation. It was a question. I didn't have an answer. Not yet. But I knew I wanted to keep being asked. I never wore that robe outside. Not because it was revealing, quite the opposite. It was thick, beige, cinched high on the waist, with sleeves long enough to cover my wrists. But something about it made me feel undone. Like stepping out in it meant I hadn't planned to be seen. Like it said too much without saying anything at all. And yet, that morning, I wore it when I walked outside with the recycling. My hair was damp. I hadn't bothered with makeup. It wasn't intentional. I hadn't decided to look vulnerable. But when I caught my reflection in the sliding door, I didn't move to fix it. I looked like someone who hadn't slept. Someone who felt too much and didn't know where to put it. He was in the driveway, crouched beside the front wheel of his car, checking tire pressure or something equally ordinary. But he stood when he saw me. Not abruptly, just fluidly, like water shifting directions. His shirt was dark gray and hung loose around his shoulders. His forearms were tanned, speckled with sawdust. I noticed everything. I hadn't spoken to him in days. Not since the flower. Not since that look. And yet, without thinking, I asked, "Everything all right with your car?" He nodded. "Just routine." "You?" I said something. I don't remember what. Something about the weather, or maybe the trash schedule. It didn't matter. The words were placeholders. The space between us wasn't made of language. It was made of something slower, heavier. I moved to lift the recycling bin, but it was heavier than usual. Waterlogged, maybe. Before I could adjust my grip, he was already stepping forward, one hand on the edge. "Let me." I should have said no. I didn't. I stepped aside. We walked toward the alley behind the house, and as we reached the gate, he paused. I turned, expecting him to hand me the bin. Instead, he stood still, watching me in a way that made my breath stumble. It wasn't the way men look when they want something. It was the way people look when they've already made peace with wanting it. And in that moment, everything slowed. The wind died. The air thickened. Even the distant hum of a lawnmower became background to something much louder that didn't make a sound. He said nothing. And then, as if it were the most natural thing in the world, he leaned closer. I didn't move. I didn't step back. My fingers clutched the tie of my robe, not from fear, but from the strange sensation that I might fall forward. His mouth touched mine like a question. Not eager, not hesitant. Just quiet, certain. And the second it happened, I knew I wouldn't stop it. Not now. Maybe not ever. It wasn't cinematic. There was no swelling music or dramatic spin. There was warmth. Pressure. The way his hand barely grazed my waist, hovering like he wasn't sure if he had the right to stay. I answered for him without speaking. I kissed him back. Not long, not deeply, but fully. When we pulled away, there was no apology in his eyes, no panic in mine, just breathing. Heavy, raw, real. Then the world resumed. A bird flapped nearby. A car door slammed down the street. The hum of everyday life crept back in. And yet, something was now irreversibly shifted. I didn't run. I didn't rush inside. We stood there for another moment, still not speaking. Then he turned and walked back toward his garage. I watched his back as he moved, the way his shoulders rolled, the way he didn't look over his shoulder. It wasn't a retreat. It wasn't shame. It was restraint. Inside the house, everything looked the same. The kitchen counters still shone. The coffee still sat cooling in the pot. But I leaned against the closed door, hand still on the handle, and felt something in me pulse back to life. A thrum I hadn't felt in years. Not lust. Not adrenaline. Something quieter. Need. Craving. Recognition. I went upstairs, peeled off the robe, and stood in front of the mirror. My lips were still flushed, my skin warmer than usual. I didn't look like someone who had been kissed. I looked like someone who had remembered she was worth kissing. Later that day, I baked. Not because I had to, but because I needed to do something with my hands. Flour, sugar, movement, repetition. It gave me structure. Gave me space to think without spiraling. But even as I moved through the motions, I kept tasting that kiss. When my husband called from the office that evening, his voice was the same as always. Steady, polite, distant. "How was your day?" "Quiet," I said. Did some baking. Save me a piece? Sure. He didn't ask what kind. He never did. That night, I set aside 2 slices of lemon loaf, one wrapped neatly in cling film, the other on a small plate. I left the plate by the fence. Not hidden, not announced. I didn't know if he'd take it, but I knew he'd know it was for him. I didn't hear the car pull into the driveway. It wasn't supposed to be there. Not that early. Not on a Wednesday. I was folding towels in the hallway when the front door opened with the kind of casual familiarity that didn't belong to strangers or surprise visits. His suitcase landed near the coat rack with a dull thud. Conference got canceled, he called out, dropping his keys in the ceramic bowl we kept by the door. Thought I'd work from home for a few days. My hands froze mid-fold. I stood there, still holding a corner of terry cloth, my mind scrambling to realign itself with the sudden shift. I wasn't prepared. Not emotionally, not mentally, not practically. He was supposed to be gone for 3 more days. I inhaled sharply through my nose, forced a smile onto my face before walking toward the foyer. He looked the same as always. Tired eyes, collared shirt slightly wrinkled from travel, that familiar blend of cologne and airplane air. When he kissed my cheek, I let it linger a second longer than usual, just to see if he'd notice. He didn't. I'll just shower, he said, already heading upstairs. The bathroom door clicked shut behind him, and I exhaled, standing there in my bare feet on the hardwood floor, the silence already rearranging itself into discomfort. For the next 2 hours, I moved through the house like I was being watched. And I was. By myself. Every step felt too loud, every movement too sharp. I kept thinking about the plate by the fence. I had no way of knowing if it was still there, if he had taken it, if he'd read anything into it, or if he knew my husband had come home and decided to leave it untouched as a gesture of caution. My heart felt like it was living in my throat. That afternoon, my husband set up his laptop at the kitchen table. He worked in that meticulous way of his, barely blinking, fingers dancing across keys with quiet confidence. I made lunch, more for the sake of noise than hunger. The clinking of utensils and the hiss of the skillet offered some kind of cover. When I set the plate in front of him, he didn't look up, just muttered a soft, "Thanks." I sat across from him, eating mechanically, barely tasting the food. Later, I stepped outside under the guise of checking the mail. The plate was gone, but something else had taken its place. A small envelope, no stamp, no name, just tucked beneath the corner of the fence where the boards didn't quite align. I didn't open it immediately. I slipped it into the pocket of my cardigan, waited until the hallway was empty, then locked myself in the laundry room. It was a short note. Just 6 words. We both pretend. But why? No signature. No handwriting flourish. Just that. I stared at it for a long time, the washing machine rumbling behind me like distant thunder. I didn't know how to answer. I wasn't even sure if I was supposed to. That night, my husband suggested we watch a movie. Something light. Something funny. I agreed, not because I wanted to, but because refusal would mean questions. I curled next to him on the couch, his arm around my shoulder, the scent of his aftershave pressing into my skin like an obligation. I let my head rest against him. I smiled at the right moments. I even laughed once, but my body wasn't there. At one point, I looked across the room and the reflection in the dark window caught my eye. We looked like a couple. Relaxed. At ease. But I couldn't stop thinking about the 6 words in my pocket. Couldn't stop wondering if he knew. If he saw it too. That we were 2 actors repeating a scene too many times, hoping muscle memory would make it real again. Later that evening, after he fell asleep with the TV still murmuring in the background, I stepped out onto the porch. The night air was cool against my skin. Across the yard, the light in his garage was still on. It was past midnight. I hesitated, then crossed the lawn barefoot, the grass damp beneath my feet. I didn't knock. I didn't call his name. I just stood at the edge of the driveway, waiting. He came out eventually, wiping his hands on a cloth, eyes narrowed slightly in the dark. I didn't speak. Neither did he. We just stood there, the tension folding in on itself, pressing down like fog. He gestured toward the workbench. There was a small wooden carving in progress. A bird, maybe. Something delicate. "It's for my daughter," he said finally. "Her birthday's coming up." I nodded. "She's 22 now. Lives in Michigan. Haven't seen her since spring." His voice was low, matter of fact. I leaned against the frame of the garage, arms crossed, feeling the cold creep up my calves. "You're good at that," I said, meaning the carving. But we both knew I meant something else. He didn't thank me, didn't respond. Instead, he asked, "Does he know?" My breath caught. "No," I said. "Not yet." A long silence settled between us, thick and restless. "You know," he said, "people always think affairs happen because something's missing. But sometimes it's not about what's gone. It's about what never got to exist." I didn't answer. He didn't ask me to stay. I didn't need to be asked. But I turned around and walked home anyway. Slowly. Inside, my husband had shifted positions on the couch, pulling the blanket higher over his chest. I stood there for a while, watching him sleep, wondering if he still dreamt of me. If he ever had. Then I climbed the stairs, took off my cardigan, placed the note in the drawer next to my bed, and lay down beside a man who loved me in theory. And I closed my eyes, holding the memory of a question that had no safe answer. The next morning began with the slow grind of routine, but everything felt louder. The sound of the toaster ejecting a slice of bread startled me. The coffee machine buzzed with an urgency that grated. My husband's voice as he took a call from upstairs seemed to echo through the walls like a siren. Or maybe it was just me. Thin-skinned, exposed in places I'd forgotten I had. I walked outside under the pretense of watering the plants, carrying the metal can with both hands, though it was barely half full. The fence was there, unassuming, almost too quiet. No plate, no flower, no note. But I stared at it anyway, as if the wood might open and whisper something I needed to hear. By noon, the temperature had risen, and the air felt too thick for comfort. I tied my hair up messily and changed into a loose shirt that hung just off one shoulder, letting it fall where it wanted. I hadn't planned on going anywhere. But the inside of the house began to suffocate me. The stillness was no longer peaceful. It was oppressive. He was in the garage again. Same posture, hunched over a workbench. The door was open, letting in a streak of sunlight that cut across his back, drawing sharp angles through the dust in the air. I walked over slowly, no explanation rehearsed, just movement toward what I didn't want to name. He didn't look up until I was already inside. His hands were stained with varnish, sleeves pushed up, jaw unshaven. There was something almost ritualistic in the way he sanded the edges of the carving, turning it slowly with focus that belonged to someone trying to stay sane. "I didn't come to stay long," I said. "I just needed to step away." "From what?" He knew the answer, but he let me fill the space with something truer than my usual excuses. "From being good," I said. He set the carving down gently and wiped his hands on a cloth, eyes fixed on the grain of the table. There were a few seconds, quiet ones, where I almost cried. Not because I was sad, because being seen without explanation has a weight of its own, and I could feel it pressing into my chest like a secret begging for air. In the corner of the garage, I noticed a photo. A small one, curled at the edges, pinned to the side of a shelf. It was a party shot. Out of focus, too dark, faces half turned. But there I was, blurry in the background, laughing mid-sentence, glass in hand. The image must have been taken weeks ago, maybe longer. I hadn't known I was in it. He caught my stare. "I kept it because of how it felt," he said. "Not because of how it looked." I didn't know what to say. I didn't even know what I was feeling. There was something illicit about seeing yourself from someone else's hidden perspective, like walking in on a conversation about you, like overhearing your name in a stranger's mouth. I left without touching him. That evening, my husband suggested we go to dinner over the weekend. Maybe try that new place by the river. I smiled. I nodded. I pretended I hadn't already planned something else. I told him I'd be taking a short solo retreat on Saturday. A wellness weekend, I said. Time for yoga, reading, sleep. He seemed genuinely pleased. You've been tense lately, he said. Maybe this will help. He didn't mean it as a slight. He meant it as care. But the words lodged somewhere between my ribs where truth tends to hurt the most. I think it will, I said. Before bed, I spent longer than usual in front of the mirror, not examining flaws, not smoothing anything down, just looking. My face hadn't changed. My body hadn't changed. But something behind the eyes had. A tightness that wasn't sadness. A hunger that had stopped waiting for permission. As I slid under the sheets beside my husband, he turned toward me and placed his hand on my waist. Gentle, familiar. But even with his touch, I felt apart. Not because I didn't love him, but because love isn't always the thing that fills you. Sometimes it just coexists with absence. When his breathing deepened into sleep, I stared at the ceiling for a long time. I thought of the photo in the garage, of the quiet way he'd said he kept it for the feeling. I wondered what it would be like to be loved for a moment instead of a memory. I told myself the tea was just a neighborly gesture, that I was simply being polite, that offering a warm drink on a cool afternoon didn't mean anything, and if it did, it was the kind of thing no one would question. But when I baked the scones that morning, lemon and lavender his favorite, though he'd only mentioned it once in passing, I already knew I was lying to myself. I set the table with more care than usual. 2 cups, the good napkins, a small plate of butter I softened just right. The sugar was in its glass jar, the milk in a tiny porcelain pitcher we never used except for guests. I didn't know what I expected him to say, or not say, but I knew I was dressing the ordinary in ceremony. He knocked once, softly, and I opened the door before he could knock again. He didn't come empty-handed. A jar of his homemade jam, dark red and imperfectly sealed, sat in his hand like a peace offering. I took it with a quiet thank you and stepped aside to let him in. The kitchen filled with silence and steam. He sat across from me, fingers tracing the edge of his cup, eyes not wandering but also not fixed. We spoke about small things first. How the mornings were colder now, how the neighborhood was quiet since the Wilsons moved. He mentioned a raccoon had been getting into his trash bins. I laughed lightly, not because it was funny, but because it gave me something to hold on to. Then the silence shifted, grew dense. He looked at me and tilted his head slightly, as if searching for something in the lines of my face. You don't look tired, he said. I blinked, confused. What do you mean? You told me last time you were tired of being good, but you don't look tired now. I didn't have a response. I sipped my tea instead, though it had already cooled. The porcelain felt heavy in my hand. He leaned back slightly, fingers still on the rim of his cup. I'm not trying to push you. I just don't know where we stand. And I don't think you do either. His honesty didn't sting. It landed like something I had expected but wasn't ready to hear out loud. I'm not avoiding it, I said. I just haven't figured out what it means yet. He nodded, slowly. His eyes didn't leave mine. Then he stood, rounded the table, and stopped a foot away. My breath hitched, not from fear, but from anticipation I could no longer deny. The room felt smaller, like everything outside those 4 walls had folded in. He reached for my wrist, lightly, as if waiting for me to flinch. I didn't. His thumb traced a line along the inside where the skin was thin and warm. I think you already know, he said, and then he kissed me. It was nothing like the first time. That one had been soft, uncertain, like walking across a frozen lake and hoping it wouldn't crack. This was different. This was deliberate. Not rushed, not aggressive. Just sure. Grounded, like we'd both stopped apologizing. His hand slid to my lower back, not possessive, but firm, like he needed the confirmation that I was there. Real, not imagined. I leaned into him before my mind could interfere, before guilt or reason or memory could wrap themselves around the moment and strangle it. We didn't speak when it ended. We didn't have to. The moment filled every silence we could have tried to cover with words. He stepped back. I looked away. My fingers trembled when I touched the edge of the table. Then the sound I hadn't expected. My phone vibrated against the counter. His eyes followed the noise, then looked back at me. I glanced at the screen. My husband's name. I didn't pick up. He watched me let it ring. Watched me breathe through the sharp ache of that decision. I didn't offer an explanation. He didn't ask for one. A minute later, he walked to the door. Before opening it, he paused, one hand on the frame. "I won't show up again unless you want me to," he said, "but I hope you do." And then he left. I didn't move for a long time. The kitchen looked the same. The plates were still in their places. The tea had gone cold. But nothing felt familiar anymore. I could still taste the kiss, still feel the heat where his hand had rested. My body remembered everything. Eventually, I picked up my phone and stared at the missed call. I could have called back, said I'd been in the shower, that I hadn't heard it, that nothing was wrong. Instead, I slid the phone into the drawer. Upstairs, I opened my closet and ran my hands along the hangers. Silks, cottons, neutrals. Everything safe. Everything calculated. I pulled out a black camisole I hadn't worn in over a year. It felt too thin for this weather, too bold for this life. I put it on anyway and stood in front of the mirror. There she was. The woman I'd forgotten. The one who once felt things first and reasoned later. And just for a moment, I didn't feel like a liar. I felt alive. When Saturday morning arrived, the air felt lighter, crisper somehow, as if it had shed a heavy coat overnight. The weekend retreat I'd planned, something to clear my head and quiet my conscience, had seemed like a good idea when I booked it. Now, though, standing beside the open suitcase, I felt an odd emptiness, a hesitation I hadn't expected. It wasn't regret exactly. More like the absence of a desire I'd convinced myself I should have. I packed lightly, placing clothes into the bag with a methodical calm that belied my thoughts. Each shirt folded neatly, each pair of leggings aligned. But my mind wasn't there. It drifted back to that moment in the kitchen, the way his thumb had brushed against the thin skin of my wrist, a single touch that lingered like a whisper hours later. I left the house quietly, barely making a sound. My husband was already downstairs, distracted by his laptop. He barely glanced up when I murmured my goodbye. His nod was automatic, and for once I was grateful for his distraction. I didn't want to pretend right now. I wasn't sure I had it in me. The drive was uneventful. Miles slipped by beneath my tires, familiar streets turning into long stretches of empty road. The hotel, a small, secluded place just beyond the city limits, was precisely what I'd imagined. Quiet, tasteful, anonymous enough to let me slip in unnoticed, yet comfortable enough not to feel suspicious. In my room, I unpacked slowly, placing my belongings around as if marking territory in an unfamiliar landscape. I ran my hand over the crisp sheets, noticing the impersonal yet welcoming feel of fresh linen. Standing by the window, I gazed outside, the late autumn trees painting the scenery in muted yellows and browns. For a moment, I felt at peace. But it didn't last. Soon my thoughts returned home. Returned to him. I reached into my bag and found the camisole I'd slipped in at the last moment. Black silk, delicate lace trim, something that didn't quite belong to the person I'd become. I put it on slowly, almost ceremonially, then watched my reflection in the mirror. The woman staring back at me looked restless, daring. Someone I was still getting to know again. The retreat schedule sat untouched on the dresser: morning yoga, afternoon meditation, an evening lecture on mindfulness. It sounded pleasant, beneficial even, but I felt resistant to all of it. I wanted stillness, yes, but not the type the retreat offered. I wanted the stillness of holding my breath just before the leap, of tension so thick it made every heartbeat count. I sat on the edge of the bed and picked up my phone, fingers hovering over the screen. I wondered if I should text him, even a simple message, something innocent enough that it wouldn't invite questions but meaningful enough to convey my thoughts. But every sentence I crafted seemed too direct, too open-ended, too eager. Instead, I set the phone down, stood, and moved toward the small balcony. The air was brisk, refreshing against my bare arms. I wrapped myself in the shawl I'd brought, closing my eyes, breathing slowly. Even here, miles away, I could still feel the memory of his touch. My skin remembered him better than I could. Time passed differently in solitude. It moved slowly at first, then quickly, then not at all. By evening, I felt more restless than ever. Dinner was quiet, uneventful, filled with polite small talk from other retreat attendees, women who came here to find something they'd lost or perhaps never had. I smiled politely but felt disconnected, separate from their experiences. They spoke of reclaiming peace, finding stillness. Meanwhile, I found myself craving the turbulence I'd left behind. Back in my room, the silence became deafening. I paced, tried reading, even considered calling home just to hear familiar sounds, anything to interrupt the quiet. But calling felt wrong, deceptive somehow. I couldn't pretend tonight, not even over the phone. I slipped into bed early, pulling the sheets up to my chin, eyes open in the dark, listening to the faint sounds of the woods outside my window. The retreat promised peace, but my body ached with longing. Not for comfort, not for routine, for something raw, unresolved. I missed the complexity of his presence, the challenge it posed to my carefully maintained facade. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by dreams that were more memories than fantasy. I woke frequently, heart racing, the room filled with the quiet hum of unfamiliarity. Each awakening felt like breaking through the surface of dark water, gasping for air. Early in the morning, still dark outside, I rose quietly. The retreat wasn't working, not in the way I'd hoped. It was too peaceful, too neat, too distant from the messiness of real life. I packed quickly, almost urgently, driven by a need to move, to act. I couldn't stay. It was pointless to pretend otherwise. Driving home in the half-light of dawn, the roads were empty, streets wet from an overnight drizzle, the headlights carving paths through morning fog. When I reached the neighborhood, I slowed instinctively, as though returning cautiously from a place I'd promised myself I'd never go again. I parked in the driveway, noticing immediately that the house across from ours, his house, was quiet, curtains drawn. A wave of uncertainty gripped me. Had I imagined this connection? Had it faded during my brief absence? Inside, the house felt different. I walked slowly through the rooms, noting details. The jacket my husband left tossed carelessly over a chair, coffee mugs sitting unwashed in the sink. The quiet wasn't peaceful. It was thick with tension, a sense that the house itself held its breath, waiting for my next move. I unpacked methodically, placing everything back where it belonged, restoring order. When finished, I stood in our bedroom, looking out the window. His garage door was closed, a silence emanating from within. Then, in an act more impulsive than I thought myself capable of, I went downstairs, opened the front door, and stepped outside. The air was damp, charged. I crossed the lawn slowly, heart thudding, stopping at the fence. My fingers traced the rough wood, feeling splinters beneath my touch. And then, finally, I saw it. A small wooden bird resting on top of the fence. It was beautifully carved, delicate, placed carefully as though waiting for me. I picked it up, feeling its smooth contours. It was a message clearer than any note or text could have been. I turned, clutching the carving, and walked back to my house, leaving the door ajar behind me, an invitation unspoken but unmistakable. The small wooden bird sat on my bedside table, quietly holding secrets. Each morning when I woke, it was the first thing my eyes searched for, proof that what had happened wasn't just a fleeting dream. My husband moved through the house obliviously, trapped in his rhythms, unaware of the subtle shifts happening beneath our careful facade. Over the following days, I waited anxiously for something else. Another gesture, another quiet signal. But nothing came. The neighbor's garage door remained shut, curtains tightly drawn, and no lights appeared in his windows at night. His absence felt intentional, strategic, almost painful. In the evenings, my husband made efforts that he usually didn't. He ordered in dinner from places we once loved, opened wine he'd saved for special occasions, played music that reminded us of earlier times. Days when we laughed easily, talked openly, touched freely. He did all the right things, all the careful, earnest attempts at closeness. And yet, I felt further away from him than ever. It wasn't anger or frustration, it was sorrow. A deep, quiet sorrow, like watching someone wave from behind a glass wall, visible yet unreachable. The affection he showed didn't ease me. It intensified the ache, reminded me of what we no longer were, and perhaps never would be again. Late one evening, after we finished another carefully staged romantic dinner, my husband took my hand across the table, holding it gently, as if afraid to break it. "I miss you," he said quietly, eyes searching my face. The raw honesty startled me. I knew what he meant. Not physical absence, but something deeper, harder to reclaim. For a moment, I wanted desperately to admit everything, to break the careful silence and spill the truth between us. But the words stuck in my throat, tangled in guilt and uncertainty. Instead, I squeezed his hand lightly and smiled in a way I hoped looked genuine. But that night, sleep never came. I lay awake, listening to his even breathing, feeling the distance in each quiet exhale. Eventually, I rose silently and moved to the window, staring across at the darkened house across the street, willing something, anything, to change. 2 days later, as if answering an unspoken plea, I found an envelope waiting in our mailbox. My heart raced at the sight of it, recognizing the paper immediately. The same plain, unmarked envelope he'd used before. Inside was a brief handwritten note. "There's a train leaving tomorrow. I have 2 tickets. I'll be there at 7. Decide." Just that. Simple words. No grand declaration, no explanations. The weight of the decision pressed heavy in my chest. All evening, I moved through the house as though sleepwalking, heart pounding quietly beneath the calm exterior. My husband watched me from the couch, frowning slightly as I folded laundry mechanically, barely hearing his words, nodding absently when he asked me questions. Everything felt far away, muffled by the roaring of my own thoughts. Later, in the privacy of our bedroom, I took out the note again, rereading it until the letters blurred. My mind raced through scenarios. What if I went? What if I stayed? Each path held consequences. Each choice would tear something from my life irreparably. The next morning, I woke early, feeling oddly calm. I showered slowly, dressing in clothing that felt intentionally neutral, comfortable enough for travel, but unassuming enough to avoid suspicion. My husband sat in the kitchen, his laptop open, sipping coffee distractedly. "I'll be home late tonight," I told him softly, trying to steady my voice. "A few errands to run." He barely looked up, giving a vague nod, his mind clearly elsewhere. The day passed in a blur of restless waiting. By evening, as the shadows lengthened, I stood in our quiet kitchen, taking in every detail. The clock above the stove ticking rhythmically, the faint scent of soap lingering in the air, the half-empty coffee cup left carelessly beside the sink. At 6:30, I stepped out of the house, heart hammering with every step down the driveway. Outside, the twilight was heavy, the world painted in shades of gray and fading gold. I glanced once at my own house, wondering briefly if I would ever see it the same way again. I reached the corner where he'd agreed to wait. He was already there, standing beside his car, hands deep in his pockets, posture casual but eyes watchful, alert. I approached slowly, breathing carefully, each step measured, purposeful. "You came," he said quietly. "I had to," I replied, voice steadier than I expected. But as we stood there in silence, reality pressed in around me. This was no fantasy, no imagined escape. This was real, irreversible, devastatingly tangible. He watched my hesitation carefully. Then softly, almost painfully, he asked, "Are you sure?" The question hit me harder than I'd anticipated. Was I sure? Could anyone be sure of something that might alter their life completely? I looked into his eyes, searching for certainty, searching for reassurance. All I found was a mirror. He was as uncertain as I was, holding on by the same thread. "I don't know," I admitted finally, honesty breaking through. He nodded slowly, understanding in his expression. He didn't move closer, didn't touch me. Instead, he opened the passenger side door silently, leaving the decision solely mine. For a long moment, I stood frozen between two lives, the weight of 1,000 unspoken words pressing down on me. I wanted desperately to move, to step forward or back, but my feet felt anchored to the pavement. Finally, I stepped toward the open door, placing one hand on the cool metal frame. The train was leaving soon. If I went, I would leave everything behind. My husband, the house, the quiet comfort I'd spent years building. If I stayed, I'd return to familiar emptiness, routine comforts masking an ache I'd grown to know intimately. Then, abruptly, headlights flashed across our faces. A familiar car turned slowly down the street. My husband's car, earlier than expected. Headlights illuminating us in a stark, merciless glare. My heart stopped. He slowed almost to a halt, looking straight at us. I met his eyes through the windshield, seeing recognition, confusion, and finally hurt wash across his face. Then slowly, wordlessly, he drove forward, parking quietly in the driveway, disappearing inside our house without a single glance back. I stood trembling, my hand still gripping the car door, suddenly acutely aware of the consequences, my heart pounding louder than the distant rumble of the train I'd planned to catch. The neighbor watched silently, waiting for my next move. I stepped back slowly, carefully shutting the car door. "I can't," I whispered finally, pain sharp in every syllable. He didn't argue, didn't plead. He simply nodded, eyes filled with quiet understanding. I turned slowly, walking back toward my house, knowing fully that whatever waited behind that familiar door, nothing would ever be the same again. The house felt utterly foreign as I stepped through the front door, as if its walls had quietly rearranged themselves during my brief absence. The lights in the hallway were dim, barely illuminating the space where I stood. My husband's keys lay carelessly on the table, as always, next to his wallet and phone. Nothing unusual there, yet the familiar scene felt charged with silent tension. He was upstairs. I could hear the faint creak of his footsteps, rhythmic and methodical, the sound both comforting and unnerving in its normality. I hesitated at the foot of the stairs, listening carefully, trying to gauge his mood from the subtle sounds overhead. But the house gave nothing away. It guarded its secrets behind silence and shadow. Slowly, carefully, I made my way up, each step feeling heavier than the last. When I reached the bedroom, he stood near the window, his back to me, posture rigid. He didn't move when I entered, didn't acknowledge my presence. He just continued to stare out into the darkness. I waited in silence, uncertain how to begin, my heart beating erratically against my chest. Minutes stretched uncomfortably between us, thick with unspoken tension. Finally, he turned around slowly, his eyes meeting mine with a quiet intensity I hadn't seen before. "I don't want explanations," he said softly, his voice strained but controlled. "Not tonight." I nodded slowly, throat tight with emotion. His refusal wasn't anger or bitterness. It felt deeper, more painful. He didn't want the careful lies or forced truths that would inevitably follow if we spoke. For tonight, at least, silence was our fragile shelter. He stepped past me, careful not to touch, and moved towards the door. He paused briefly on the threshold, head slightly bowed, shoulders heavy with exhaustion. For a moment, it seemed he might speak again, but he didn't. Instead, he simply walked out, closing the door quietly behind him, leaving me alone in the dimly lit room. I stood motionless for several moments, absorbing the weight of what had just happened. His calm had rattled me more than anger could have. It was resignation, an acceptance of something irreparably changed. It felt final. Slowly, I sank onto the edge of our bed, fingers gripping the sheets tightly, their coolness grounding me. My thoughts raced, fragmented and chaotic, looping back through the events of the evening. The scene at the car, the look in my husband's eyes through the windshield, the quiet understanding of the man across the street as I stepped away. Each image burned vividly into my mind, each one painful in its clarity. The wooden bird still sat quietly on my bedside table, small and delicate, a silent reminder of all I'd almost given away. I reached out and picked it up carefully, turning it over slowly in my hand. It felt impossibly light, fragile, just like everything else in my life now. Sleep didn't come easily that night. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the house creak and settle around me, wondering if it, too, felt the weight of the secrets it now held. At some point, I must have drifted off, dreams restless and fragmented, blending reality and anxiety into a confusing blur. I woke early, feeling drained and unsettled. My husband wasn't beside me. The space where he usually lay was undisturbed, pillows untouched, sheets smooth. He'd never come to bed. I found him downstairs in the kitchen, already dressed, his face calm but carefully neutral. He handed me a cup of coffee silently, the gesture polite, distant. We drank without speaking, the quiet, oppressive, yet strangely comforting. As he gathered his things for work, I felt compelled to break the silence, to say something, anything, to acknowledge the enormous shift that had occurred between us. But every word felt inadequate, trivial. Instead, I watched him quietly, feeling a helpless sorrow rise inside me. At the door, he paused briefly, turning slightly to meet my eyes. "Take care today," he said softly, his voice gentle but detached. And then he left, closing the door firmly behind him. The emptiness he left behind felt overwhelming. I moved slowly through the house, feeling oddly disconnected from familiar spaces. Every room seemed tainted by what had happened, each corner holding invisible echoes of betrayal and disappointment. I spent the day trying to find distraction, reorganizing closets, cleaning countertops, arranging furniture, anything to keep my thoughts at bay. But it didn't help. The quiet of the house kept whispering the truth back to me. By evening, I couldn't bear the silence anymore. I stepped outside, needing air, movement, anything different. The sun was low, casting warm amber shadows across the yard. I glanced instinctively toward the neighbor's house. Everything was silent there, too, the curtains still drawn, the garage closed tight. In that moment, I understood clearly that I was alone in this. Neither man would step forward now. One had chosen distance out of respect, the other out of quiet hurt. Both waited for my move, my decision, my clarity. But clarity felt impossibly far away, obscured by guilt and longing. When darkness finally settled, I returned inside and wandered through the rooms restlessly, feeling trapped within the familiar walls. I paused by the window, staring out again toward his house, waiting hopelessly for something. A movement, a sign. But the windows remained dark, silent, indifferent. In bed that night, I tossed restlessly, exhausted yet unable to find peace. Eventually, sleep overtook me, dragging me down into uneasy dreams filled with glimpses of the choices I'd made, the chances I'd missed, the damage I'd inflicted unintentionally. When I woke again, morning sunlight filled the room, warm and bright, a stark contrast to my tangled emotions. I sat up slowly, looking around the familiar space, feeling strangely detached. A new resolve quietly stirred within me. This couldn't continue. The uncertainty, the waiting, the silence. It was too heavy a burden to carry indefinitely. Downstairs, I found a neatly folded note waiting for me on the kitchen counter. My heart quickened as I opened it slowly, recognizing my husband's careful handwriting immediately. It was short, simple, and yet its quiet finality stunned me. I need space to think. I'll be staying at a hotel for a few days. Please respect this. No anger, no accusations, just quiet dignity. I sank onto the nearest chair, holding the paper tightly between trembling fingers, understanding clearly the crossroads at which we now stood. He'd left the decision entirely in my hands, trusting me to choose our future or to accept its end. And as I sat alone, clutching his words, I knew without doubt, whatever happened next, nothing would ever be simple again. Days passed slowly after he left. The house, once comforting in its predictability, had turned into a quiet monument of uncertainty. Each corner echoed with memories, small moments, insignificant at the time, but now unbearably sharp. The way my husband used to lean casually against the kitchen counter, coffee in hand, unaware of the distance growing between us. The quiet evenings we spent side by side, each absorbed in our own distractions, never speaking about the slow drift pulling us apart. I wandered through rooms feeling like a ghost, present, yet detached from everything I touched. Friends called occasionally, their voices cautious, sensing something had shifted but afraid to pry too deeply. I answered their questions vaguely, giving just enough detail to keep their concern at bay, too exhausted by my own confusion to manage theirs. Across the street, the neighbor's house remained silent and shuttered. He had retreated fully, either out of respect or guilt, leaving me entirely alone in this aftermath. Yet even his absence felt intentional, a quiet choice that spoke louder than any words could. One afternoon, as gray clouds gathered and rain tapped softly against the windows, I decided to clear out the attic. It was a desperate attempt to occupy myself, to find distraction from the heavy silence pressing down on me. Each box contained fragments of a life we'd built together. Photographs, souvenirs, mementos collected from vacations and anniversaries. Every item reminded me of what we'd had and what I'd quietly dismantled piece by piece. Among the clutter, I found a small album, our wedding photos. My fingers trembled slightly as I flipped through the pages, memories frozen in glossy paper, captured smiles and posed embraces. I paused at a photo of us laughing, carefree, standing together under a sunlit sky. It was almost painful, this snapshot of genuine happiness. I stared at our faces, wondering how we'd let that ease slip away unnoticed. That evening, alone at the kitchen table, I composed several messages to my husband. Each one carefully worded, attempting sincerity without expectation, vulnerability without pressure. But each message felt insufficient, hollow, unable to carry the weight of what needed to be said. Eventually, I deleted them all, setting the phone down gently, surrendering once more to silence. Sleep continued to elude me. Each night I lay awake, eyes tracing shadows across the ceiling, thoughts cycling endlessly. What if I'd gone that evening? What if I'd stayed away from the fence entirely? What if I'd spoken honestly sooner? Each question only deepened my restlessness. Finally, after days of unbearable quiet, I decided to walk. The neighborhood streets were empty, houses softly illuminated, families quietly tucked away within their private worlds. I moved slowly, feet guiding me automatically toward the small park nearby, hoping fresh air might bring clarity. Sitting alone on a cold bench, wrapped tightly in my coat, I watched leaves dance gently to the ground, the world indifferent to the turbulence inside me. It was there, in the stillness of that public yet isolated place, that I felt something shift. A quiet realization beginning to surface. Perhaps my greatest mistake hadn't been betrayal itself, but silence. The silence I'd allowed to widen into an impossible chasm, filled with assumptions, fears, and misunderstandings. Returning home, determined to break this destructive quiet, I finally took out my phone again, writing a simple but honest message. "I'm sorry, please, can we talk?" The response didn't come immediately, and every minute felt stretched into eternity. When my phone finally vibrated, my heart jolted sharply. It was short, cautious. "Yes, tomorrow, 5 p.m. I spent the following day preparing mentally, carefully considering each word I might use. I rehearsed explanations, apologies, confessions, discarding each as inadequate. Nothing felt enough to bridge the gap I had created. Still, I knew I had to try. Silence had taken too much already. As 5 o'clock approached, anxiety rose sharply within me. I sat rigidly at the kitchen table, listening closely for the sound of his car. When headlights illuminated the driveway, my breath caught painfully in my throat. The front door opened quietly, his footsteps cautious yet determined. When he stepped into the kitchen, our eyes met hesitantly, both of us waiting for the other to speak first. Finally, quietly, he broke the silence. "I didn't come here to fight or blame," he said carefully. "I just want to understand." I nodded slowly, relief mingling painfully with remorse. "I never wanted to hurt you," I began quietly. "This wasn't about us, not really. It was about something in me, something I'd lost, or maybe never really found." He listened quietly, face neutral but eyes reflecting deep hurt. "Then why not talk to me sooner?" I was afraid. I admitted softly, voice shaking slightly. "Afraid of disappointing you? Afraid of being honest about things that didn't seem important until they were?" He exhaled slowly, fingers tracing circles on the table. "And him? What was that about?" I paused, searching carefully for truthful words. He saw me, not the way you see someone every day, but deeper, without effort or obligation. It made me feel alive again, and I got lost in it. He nodded slowly, absorbing the honesty of my admission. Silence settled between us again, heavy but necessary. After a long moment, he looked up again, his expression softer now, but still guarded. "I don't know if we can fix this," he finally said, voice quiet but firm. "But I want to try. I can't promise I'll forgive completely or trust easily, but I want to at least understand how we ended up here." My eyes filled suddenly with tears, a mix of grief and gratitude. That's all I could ever ask. That night, we spoke carefully, cautiously navigating truths long avoided. It wasn't easy, nor comfortable, but for the first time in months, honesty filled the spaces that silence had occupied. When morning came, he didn't leave. He stayed, not out of obligation or comfort, but genuine willingness to face the painful process of rebuilding. Across the street, the neighbor's house remained quiet, respectful in its continued absence. I knew now he would never interfere again. His silence spoke clearly of an understanding that this was no longer his story. In the days and weeks that followed, my husband and I worked carefully, slowly, to untangle the damage done. It wasn't perfect, and perhaps never would be, but the effort was genuine and honest, rooted deeply in acknowledgement, communication, and painful truths no longer hidden. The carved wooden bird remained on my bedside table, not as a symbol of betrayal, but a quiet reminder of lessons learned too late, of silence, of honesty, and of the fragile beauty in choosing to speak rather than remain hidden. Life would never return exactly as it had been before. But perhaps it wasn't meant to. Perhaps real healing required this careful dismantling, this slow reconstruction from broken but honest foundations. And so we began again, step by cautious step, knowing fully the weight of what had happened, but determined now, finally, to speak clearly rather than retreat quietly behind walls of silence.